Okay, we're live. I should probably have a script to welcome everybody to dive into world building. We are diving into world building today, and you may notice that some of our participants have fancy clothes on of various varieties. I have been encouraged to wear my gray tailcoat, and Reggie has a lovely pair of glasses, and Che has a tiara, and Kimberly is featuring a delightful shade of blue.
There we go.
I will apologize for all the coughing that I'm going to do today. But such is life when your kids are at a new school. So, yeah, today we're talking about fashion. And fashion is really fun. And the thing about it for me is fashion gets treated differently across genres. And what I have found is that some genres, such as steampunk and romance, you would expect to find quite a bit of focus on fashion. And then other genres, I'm not going to say uniformly, but often science fiction, you know, there's much less concentration. So if you're looking at historical, you're going to find a lot of focus on fashion because fashion is part of what defines the period in which the story takes place. However, there can be a sense that, well, fashion is just kind of froofy topic, and I really don't feel that way. I feel like fashion is something that people don't often take advantage of to its fullest extent. Because, I mean, obviously I come out of this background of anthropology. So to me, what kind of clothes you put your characters in is really important to telling people about the world and about who the characters are, because we basically telegraph our identity with our clothes. It's connected to the world because it tells you all kinds of things about like what's available to make clothes with, right? Available materials, and also a personal identity and cultural identity. If there's a trend in fashion, right? Whose trend is it? And what does it mean? Right? I mean, fashion it's often easy to get distracted by the what. Oh, what are they wearing? Well, do we really have to go to the trouble of putting them in clothes? Right? Well, they've got to be wearing something. Let's just put them all in identical jumpsuits. That will work.
When did the jumpsuits show up? I mean, I know, I seem to remember early science fiction, particularly in films and in television, seemed a lot more elaborate costume-wise. And then sometimes, I want to say it was like the 60s, where we went to this, everybody in the future wears a gray jumpsuit.
I don't understand it.
Yeah.
I remember that way back in the beginning when I was first reading my Varn World, it was very amusing because, so just to finish my thought, we want to get past the what? We want to get past the who and the whom, and we want to get to the why and the how, right? Because all of those questions are really important for fashion. So what I was going to say was, back when I was creating my Varn World initially, I showed it to a friend of mine, and she was like, wow, I'm surprised. They're not all wearing the same color robes. Now, mind you, this is my delightful friend who is not a genre reader, and her acquaintance with genre has grown in the, 15 years, or 10 or 15 years that I've now known her. But as a non-genre reader, she had this impression that the minute you enter science fiction or fantasy, everybody's wearing identical robes. Right?
And big headdresses.
Or something. And so And so I think that there's this kind of perception, maybe coming out of Star Trek, that, the Federation has uniforms, and so there's this sort of, we have to have uniforms kind of. Uniformity is very common. Um, and the nice thing about uniformity is it's really easy, right? But it's really not normal because we don't all cross-identify, right? I mean, it works for the Federation, but, diverse societies, all bets are off. And it's worth thinking through that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the uniform itself, like, I think it's about context. Like, obviously, Star Trek, you have the Federation, Battlestar Galactica. It's it's military. In that, so you'd see a uniform. Although with that you do see differences in the civilian population, which is interesting, and how, like, and the government, like, there was one episode where the President Laura Roslin, like, the big thing was, like, after the catastrophe happened and they realized they were going to be traveling in space through eternity, she was like, well, I have 2 outfits. Like, and it was mentioned, and I thought that was an interesting way to address some of that sort of issue.
Yeah. Well, I think that there isn't enough done to include fashion elements in plots.
Yeah.
There's a lot of opportunity for hidden weaponry and subterfuge and
hidden weaponry.
Well, there's also it denotes rank and wealth and status. So if you're trying to hide, everybody puts on, like, their hobo outfit. And then if they're trying to pass for nobility, you gotta get out the velvet.
Yeah, velvet's like the key.
Yeah.
For nobility. It's like the magic word. I'm the person.
So expensive.
Velvet.
Well, I think I'm going back through my long and somewhat psychotic history of sci-fi exposure, and it seems that the more utopian the society, the more boring the fashion. Like, if you look at Logan's Run.
That's interesting, yeah.
Everybody's equal, everybody wears the same outfit, or even THX-1138. Everybody wears the same thing. It's, a or the same robes or something, and it isn't until you get into the underpinnings of those societies, which invariably do, because that's where the interesting stuff happens, that you see the change, right? I think it's interesting to, and I know that people who do costume design, and I know that the artists who work on that type of development within a show or within a film do try to put in that symbolism in there. And so I kind of wonder how much of it is deliberate, i.e., as opposed to, we're too cheap to buy, enough stuff to make more than 2 costumes.
Well, yeah, there is that. There's definitely that. It's an interesting question.
Well, I mean, a film has to function on, like, a visual, thematic, and symbolic sort of level that a book and real life don't function on. So, and I think it is that it's just like in sci-fi, like, oh, fashion is just frippery. We don't have to describe it. They're all wearing, like, spacesuits or something.
There is a cultural sense in science fiction that fashion is frippery.
Yeah, it's just, oh, that's what romance writers do.
Well, and you know what? There's also the chauvinist factor, right? That fashion concerns are for women and thus not worthy of concern.
And we just wear whatever our wives buy for us.
Yeah, like whatever, but I think that so what can we use it for? It's identity marking.
Mhm.
And when I say identity, I don't just mean, well, I choose my own clothing to mark my identity. It marks membership in social groups.
Yeah.
Um, so, if you don't mind, I will lay out some tricks of my Varan world. In the Varan world, there are 7 castes. 7 is a lot. I didn't want to just say, you wear a red robe if you're this, and you wear a blue robe if you're this, and you wear, that's annoying, because then you just have to color code everybody. So, so I decided that everybody was going to have something a little different, and so the nobility has no mark whatsoever. They just have their own fashions. And they just happen to be able to afford the most expensive spider silk, which kind of glitters in the light. And you can always tell when you're looking at one because they look like they're not wearing a mark, right? This plays into the social invisibility of caste identity for the nobles. They don't feel the caste system the way everybody else does because they're not legally required to wear a mark. They're the exception to every rule, right? So it was important to me that they not have to mark themselves. The officers caste, which is the next one down, they have a color. Their color is rust red. It's what they call in Varan a regulated color. And so if anybody catches you wearing the Arisan rust red and you're not an Arisan, you are in big trouble. Probably headed for arrest, jail, etc. Okay? But uniforms are very common among the Arisan, but they're not a caste mark, if you can see what I'm saying. So that if you see somebody in a rust red uniform, you definitely know that they're an Arisan. However, if you see somebody out of uniform and they're an Arisan, they will have rust red somewhere on them. And so they tend to gravitate towards red and white as colors. So there are elements to the fashion identity that are regulated and others that are just traditional. The next caste down is the servant caste, the Imbati, and they are civil servants, lawyers, bureaucrats, personal servants to the nobility. Okay, their mark is a tattoo on the forehead. It's a tattoo because it's a sign of their dedication and their vocation, and depending on whether they are in service to the courts or the state or an individual, they'll have a different tattoo. Right? But nobody else is getting tattoos on their face. So that is the regulated mark of the Imbati. And they're all very proud when they get it, when they turn adult and choose their vocation. Right? They also tend all to wear black. So, everybody's aware, well, Imbati always wear black. Right? And rich Imbati will wear black silk. And nobles will never wear black, right? There's a dress that I put in my novel For Love for Power that's black. And when the servant looks at it, he says, well, the thing that raises it from Imbati to breathtaking is the diamonds all over it that are recreating the Starry Night. But it's like this dress is a complete shocker of a fashion statement because nobility never wear black, right? I don't need to go through all the details. So for artisans, it's gray coats. This is why I own this gray coat. For laborers, miners and farmers, they wear thick black belts. The the merchants wear silver necklaces with chrysolite stones in them, and the undercast wear a dark gray hood. Everybody's got something different. And it's those particular things that are regulated, right? You're really not going to see that light gray color on anybody but an artisan, even though the coats can come in all kinds of different styles. It's not like you have to wear a lab coat, but if you do, it's going to be gray, right? You can wear a tailcoat if you're a musician, right? You can wear a long flowy coat if you are, if you're a painter or whatever, but it's going to be gray. So what I'm trying to build in is that there are regulations within the society, but there is room for personal expression within those.
Well, yeah, like if I went to Catholic grade school, right? We all had to wear a uniform, of course.
Yeah.
But you would still see, people would still kind of make them their own, especially in the 80s. There were so many junky, toy-looking pieces of jewelry that the cool kids would have and wear. Or the kids in the Catholic school whose parents happen to have more money, you would see more of those gadgets, like more of those pens with like fluffy tops on them and stuff. So the way that you would accessorize a uniform would tell you, that like gives you an opportunity for the individual expression, even though it's limited. So yeah, so I see, and that's an interesting point. I think that tracks over to real world experience.
I'm not going to be able to keep the coat, you guys. It's a little too warm over here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to talk about, too, was, like, in terms of the science fiction world, particularly when you're talking about things like interstellar travel or different geography, is the utilitarian aspect of fashion.
Yeah.
Like and we've talked about that. Like I think with Dune was the example about you have a suit that's specially equipped to transfer your fluids and make them useful.
The still suits from Dune. That's a really good example. Yep. And when you look at, gosh, there are all kinds of examples of utilitarian fashion, like armor. And like they did a lot of great stuff on the utilitarian fashion in Lord of the Rings movies.
Yes, they did.
I mean, utilitarian doesn't mean just stripped down to the basics, though. I think we again.
Oh no, absolutely not. That's a good point, Che.
Yeah, it's because I mean, and you look at like medieval, armor and stuff. People decorated everything as much as you could afford.
Yep.
It would be decorated, and craftsmen worked on it, and there's and like almost like this sort of like overly anatomically correct like Roman breastplates.
Oh yeah.
Decorations, lion heads.
The bat nipples.
Yeah, I mean, come on. So, but we have gotten into, after, you're right about the 60s being a turning point in design, where suddenly it was like futurism translated to everything being stripped down to, it was like, form follows function. Modern architecture was like that, where all the decorative elements were stripped completely out of it. And you see that in like the fashion of the 60s. A lot of it was very simple shapes and simple colors. I mean, I'm not talking about the hippies either. That was a counterculture to that almost was.
Right, the bohemian like
fabrics and cottons and bohemian.
And batik and this, that, and the other, yeah.
Yeah, and more ethnic clothing. So it's like you're right about that. The 60s were where we got the uniform gray jumpsuit that everybody freaking wears, and it's unfortunate that it has remained with us sort of even as like street fashion has changed. I mean, that's not for every movie, but you still get quite a few, I think.
Yeah.
And
So if you don't mind, let's take a moment to talk about the difference between using fashion in visual media and using fashion in text.
Yeah, I think that's really good idea.
Because you have to treat it very differently.
well, you have to spend time describing things.
Right. I mean, putting a lot of words on your fashion is not ideal, right? I mean,
Tedious read.
you don't want to put a lot of words on it.
I do.
Well, okay.
Well, I mean, it depends, but I really do end up describing. I'm one of those. I describe the weather and I describe the clothing.
That's okay. So what I'm going to say, what I'm going to observe is, in the genres where fashion is considered to be vital / more acceptable, you're going to have a greater tolerance for putting more words on it. But in contexts where it's less acceptable to spend a lot of time talking about fashion, clothing, jewelry, accessories, whatever, then you need to find reasons why it would be a good idea for you to put those words on it. So, you know, if you're doing something important, like, for example, I mean, if I'm working in my foreign cast system, I gotta mention those cast marks. They're pretty important because they're going to change everything about how the characters interact, right? If I don't mention that, I mean, and at least explain it once, you're not going to be able to know what the social contract is. So in that way, this is really important. And there are other ways to make fashion important as well, because this is how people judge each other, right?
Yeah.
So it's, you know, the best way to get a good excuse for talking about somebody's fashion is to give your character an opportunity to judge them.
Yeah.
You know? You know, it goes back to your
wearing.
point about, you know, as fancy as they can afford, right? So, oh man, I look at that person and I see this. Clearly they're rich and I should be really afraid to interact with them. Or, you know, other kinds of things, right? I wanted to give two fashion and plot examples from my book. Hopefully that'll be useful. It's a sort of a symbolic thing as well as a visual thing. And Reggie's just running through her glasses here, so we have to point that out so that we can, like, all enjoy it. Wow, you look like you're a...
I have to say it's an impressive collection.
Well, thank you. The dollar store is excellent for this kind of stuff. That's where I get all of it.
I bet. So I have one of my character's moms give him a jacket for his birthday. And I go into a lot of detail about this jacket and what it looks like and what it's made of and whatever. Because part of what it's doing is it's messing around with all of the social expectations. So it's part silk and it's part not silk. And instead of being uniform jewel colors, which is this current fashion among the nobility, because it's a sort of internally referenced, we live underground, so we're going to do the jewel thing, and we all conform to this particular pattern of being. It's woven to look like the ocean with light glinting off of it, which is symbolizing his interest in change and difference, and how that affects chaos and stuff like that. It's also wearing this is also a form of rebellion against his father, who's a very repressive guy. The fact that he would wear it to the birthday party that his father organized so his father could get him into politics, right, is a social and personal statement that brings that sort of subversive design of the coat into an environment where it's not expected. And it's fun that way, and it can be symbolic at the same time that it's literal fashion and literal teen rebellion of a sort, right? And the rebellion of the mom against the dad as well. So there are a lot of aspects of that. Oh, and I can't remember the other one. Oh, right. This is in the book that I'm currently working on. I have this town that's on the far side of the country where strange and unusual things are happening. And over the course of 3 books, it's going to become really important that we know about this town. And that strange and subversive things are happening in this town. But, like, it's on the other side of the country. How in the heck am I going to go, well, you need to know about this town. And you might later find out that strange and subversive things are happening there. And I don't want it to be a super surprise when it starts to happen and suddenly, oh, this town becomes relevant. Oh, gee, right? So I was thinking through, well, what the heck am I going to do to get mentions of this town and its subversiveness in on the ground floor of this book so that people can not notice them at first and then see the pattern later. And fashion! Okay? Seriously, I was like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Oh, that's right, the air loves fashion. And so the very latest fashion is embroidered silk coats. And they're from Salimna. And so I give this opportunity for him to come in wearing this coat, talking to his brother, and his brother's like, what the heck is this you're wearing? You know, have you been hanging out with artisans lately? What the, you know, dude, come on. How low can you go, right? And he's like, no, this is, you know, if you ever went out, you'd see this is the latest fashion among the nobility. They're from Salimna. They're really cool, you know? Yeah. And so what I'm going to be doing is basically seeding a whole bunch of art and fashion stuff, and everything that's new is going to be coming out of this town. So
Yeah.
it's going to be very useful for me that when you then find events and strange other things coming out of the town, that you're like, oh, wait a second, this is a big pattern. And it's not just one guy doing one thing, but there's this consistent innovation and change and difference coming out of this town.
Well, I think, and this is really interesting because if you think about our own world, like fashion, it's like you can choose to notice it or choose to not, but it's in the air you breathe. It's like part of the visual landscape of human beings as it exists. And translating that to text is, I mean, it's not always easy, you know? Like, I think about, we were talking about historical romances earlier, or steampunk, and when you talk about the fashion, there are very specific terms to describe fashion. So it's like you have to have this like knowledge, or at least, you know, Wikipedia in front of you.
Yeah, that's true. There are specific terms.
That's part of it too. And then you have colloquial terms, right? I'm thinking of like consensus reality as we know it. Different colloquial terms to describe different pieces of fashion. So then you get into issues of language, which is your wheelhouse, Juliet.
Yeah, I know. I'm over here going, yeah, language. Thank you, Reggie.
Sweater versus jumper.
Well, and you know, like
Spelled it wrong.
wearing your pants low, showing your underwear.
Yeah.
That is like
ponytail holder versus gum band, if you're in Pennsylvania.
Oh, how funny.
Yeah. Some people call all sneakers tennis shoes.
Yeah.
That is a weird one to me. Like, people would say that to me, and I'm like, no, that's a very tennis shoes to me is a specific type of shoe, and it's
Uh-huh.
not all sneakers, right? But
Yeah.
this person, all sneakers are tennis shoes, and then I noticed it was more than one person.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I'm originally from Montana, and it's like, yeah, tennis shoe, sneakers, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
They're all the same, even though there are legit tennis shoes.
Yes, yes.
Um,
No, that's true. Um, I think that's a really good point. Uh, so if you're working in a real world situation or a quasi real world situation, you have to be very careful about your terminology,
Right.
right? Um, because I think when you're dealing with steampunk, you're going to be wanting to take your terminology directly out of the Victorian era, and there are a lot of very specific terms for the fashions that are used there. Similarly, you know, if you have a time period of inspiration, that you're going to want to go directly to the actual fashions, the actual terminology, and be importing those because they come with all kinds of associations and value judgments,
mhm.
and if you want to import the culture of that specific period, you probably want also to import the specific value judgments, etc. And if you don't, you have to approach it a very different way. Um,
It gives you an interesting opportunity for subtext too. I mean, if you're working with or if you're referencing a period fashion or if you're
yeah,
using period references, you know that that's got baggage, right?
yeah,
So you're not all of your readers will necessarily know that baggage, but it gives you a way to
right.
speak to the readers who do understand, right? It's like, if you describe somebody wearing a pillbox hat,
Yes, yes, yes.
one generation is going to have one idea and it's going to have a whole series of images that are evoked, and then another generation is going to have a different,
Yes,
and the people who understand the provenance of the pillbox hat in general and its place in history are going to have another understanding. So it does
right.
give you, and that type of subtext I find is appreciated
Yeah.
by readers, right? They really enjoy it when an author it adds depth by invoking that kind of
And it
subtext and that
does.
kind of shorthand.
And you have to make sure that your subtext matches your text,
Yeah.
right? Because, say, this is actually one of the issues with the science fictional bland uniforms, right?
Mhm.
That you don't want to bring in something that has a very specific grounded subtext because, like peace symbols, you don't
Mhm.
want to have your, 25th century, blah, whatever, wearing peace symbols unless there is actually a reason for them to make that connection
Right.
symbolically back to the origins of the peace symbol, right?
Sure.
Or alternatively, you have to, you could, I suppose, use them and make people go, "Wah," right? But you'd have to build an alternate explanation into it in order to justify its presence there, and then you could actually possibly make interesting use of the expectations surrounding the symbol for one group versus another group. But the point being um, that there's this tendency to use generic terminology
Mhm.
in science fiction, and I think the generic thing has to do with subtext. Uh, because you want to be careful not to haul in an entire, harvest of subtext that is not intentional.
Right. And that's not appropriate or may not be appropriate. I mean, if you're on an
Right.
alien world, I can see
Yeah.
places you could do it, do it in the story, but, using it as an opportunity for deliberate misunderstanding, right? An entire
Uh-huh.
race that finds the Hitler mustache to be particularly endearing. I can see a host of first contact stories gone wrong based on fashion choices, right?
Oh yeah.
So, everybody steps off the alien spaceship, walks down to the White House, and they've all got little Hitler mustaches and knee-high boots, and that happens to be their thing.
Go forth and write it, Kimberly. I want to see it.
I think I have too many Germans in my background to be able to pull that one off.
Oh, yeah, no, but I mean, there is that, and there is, there is the question of beauty versus ugliness, right?
Mm-hmm. Fashion. Are we going to extend fashion to like hairstyles and personal grooming habits? I mean, we can.
I don't see for me anyway, when I think of fashion, I think of the broader. I think of personal architecture, the things that you do or wear or accessorize with that you use to speak non-verbally, as opposed to who's on the runway this week. I mean, that's my personal
absolutely
take on fashion, but.
Well, I mean,
No, absolutely. I think it's. You can go into makeup and there's a whole raft of things that you can do with this topic that I guarantee you we will not get to today.
I know.
Well, I mean, because we just don't, we don't talk for 5 hours. We all have to go have lunch. But yeah. So.
So I don't know if everybody noticed, but there was something just happened in the sidebar in response to one of my goofy things that I think actually would be really interesting to play with in a science fiction brand new world context, and that is, and as Kimberly mentioned earlier, the Hitler mustache. Like, there are these very basic, simple visual cues that will like call people back or like recall certain things about pop culture, like figures like Shay, made the association with Groucho Marx from the nose glasses. And then with the Hitler mustache, I mean, that's like, you can't, like, a person couldn't do that today as a fashion thing and, like, really kind of not have problems.
Yeah. They get stamped.
Yeah, so, like, in a science fictional brand new world building situation, you could have something like that has this insanely involved story behind it that's impactful of the culture that you're creating.
Right. Or a particular person. Or like sideburns.
Yes.
Like these very specific things I'm thinking about. I think his name was Burnside, seriously. The guy who invented the sideburn was Burnside.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, but weren't there because in the 1800s, people would have all sorts of.
That was like the era of facial hair fashion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'd wax your mustache, and there was all these different forms, and walrus whiskers, and
it was distinctive. I mean, you could tell people apart on the battlefield by their facial hair. There's a group out there that's putting together it's a beard spotting guide for Civil War era generals.
Wow.
So you can tell them all apart by by their facial hair, by okay, this is the silhouette you get from this particular general, and this is the silhouette you get from another one. So I can't help but think it was somewhat deliberate.
Yeah.
Maybe.
That's pretty funny. We actually went to a tea museum, and they had the special mustache teacup.
Oh my God!
I have heard of the mustache teacup.
Yeah, they're round like a regular teacup, except that they have a little piece that's been built in to protect your mustache from the tea. And there's it's almost like, imagine basically your basic travel coffee mug, right, with a thing, and then a little hole down here. Except that instead of being completely solid, it's just the area that would cover your mustache.
So you could just sip through without getting crap.
Right, and it's made all out of porcelain, and it's gorgeous.
Oh my God, that's awesome!
It's the funniest thing ever.
But that's actually, there's another opportunity there with fashion and your world building.
Absolutely.
Like,
Yes. Like, build something like the mustache cup into your world. Would that be funny?
oh my gosh.
It'd be
And then that
delightful.
maybe is your status symbol right there. Is it a guilt cup?
Uh-huh.
Does it have, is
Does
it
it
just
have a mustache protector?
Exactly.
Well, you can see, the voices in my head are reminding me that I want to say Elizabethan era, maybe Victorian era, there were things like, adjustments made to sidewalks because of the footwear that people wore.
Mm.
And there are a number of historical incidents where, people have changed, the way that horse carriages are made, or women riding side saddle. I mean, a side saddle is a complicated piece of engineering. But it was built so that ladies could ride horses and still be ladylike. I mean, and
bloomers, and it goes the other way too. Bloomers were invented so women could ride bicycles.
Yeah.
exactly.
Yay, love it.
And the and the little ties that they used to have for men's trousers so they wouldn't get caught up in bicycle chains. So there is I don't know how much depth you can go to that level of depth. I guess the other question is, how much depth is the reader going to care about? I mean, for us, it's really cool to know that, because men had these fancy shoes where the tips came all the way up to their knees, you had to have, an extra step on the carriage. But how, is that the kind of world building that's important to us to have so we can reference it somewhere, or is it the type of world building that's important to expose to the readers?
Well, I think so. My opinion, which I am never shy about expressing, is that it's important to know that these things are there and that these things are possible, because you don't want to have a lot of these things in your story.
Yeah.
But if you have one or two, the implication is that the world is so much bigger and that it's so much better and that it's so much more real.
Yeah.
Just making sure to have a specific in-depth detail somewhere causes the reader to go, oh, I need to really imagine this world in a lot more depth and detail, right?
Right.
Because I know that I can. I can trust as a reader that if I were to ask, I could go deeper. I could find out more, right? And actually, I have a fashion choice in one of my very first ever published short story. I basically have these two people going up in a shuttle, and they're about to try to talk to an alien, right? And in order to help them learn more about this alien and what she was up to, they are taking a look at something that she was wearing when she was found. And their interest in this coat is basically anthropological, right? But the two of them spend a bunch of time looking at the coat and examining it to figure out what the implications of it are. So she's a reptile person, the alien is. And so when they find her in the desert, she's wearing something called sun armor, which is like a leather coat that only covers the top of you, that has perforations in it to allow for circulation, but is covered in white feathers to try to deflect the heat. Okay? And it's also old. It's an heirloom. You can tell because some of the places where it ties on have been replaced. And some of the feathers have been replaced, right? And so you take this moment to look deeply into a culture and its technology and its traditions and its physiological needs through this object. And it's one moment in the story, but it does a lot for the sense of world and for the larger implications. So small details can make for big implications.
Yeah. And then my answer to or my opinion on the question about how much detail and when and how much it's going to matter to the reader, whether we're talking about fashion or how somebody does their agriculture in a world, is that you reveal those details as they are necessary.
Yep.
And it, just like a scene, like when you write your scene, it should have multiple functions, right? With an object, it's kind of interesting because it will have multiple functions that aren't always clear as you're writing.
Yeah.
And I just forgot the trail of my thought.
Oh, great trail of thought. No, I think you're right. You reveal as necessary, and you can also give people reasons to be paying attention to particular things at particular times. All of those detective stories give their detectives opportunities to show their intelligence by recognizing detail, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the details that you reveal are not just there to be details. They're there to do other things. Multiple functions in the narrative.
Well, I've seen some like epic fantasy where like the details sort of aren't given, and it gives like there's a sense that the world exists just for the span of this book, and that it has no future or no real past, and that you can't imagine it progressing technologically or anything because it's just background setting for this story.
Yeah. That's what those details help you to avoid. All right, other thoughts. My brain is starting to slow down.
Yeah, the urban fantasy question I think is really interesting because it's so easy to gloss over stuff, I think.
Say more to me. Tell me more about that, Reggie.
Well, I think I'm saying this because a lot of my stuff has an urban fantasy flavor to it, and because sometimes I'll get like, and the thing is when I write, it's always character based, and like it's people reacting to each other, and then sometimes I'll have to go back in and flesh out my prose a bit with detail,
right?
Because there's this. You think about a flying creature, and like while you have it in your head, and actually I think this is a struggle for any writer in any genre, in terms of anchoring your reader in the physical details of the world, and if there's something different about it in your head, finding the right words to get it on the page so that the reader makes that connection with the same image you have, I think is difficult. And with urban fantasy, you're often talking about shapeshifters,
Mm-hmm.
or mythological creatures that people have some familiarity with. And then often, at least in my first drafts, like I'll find myself kind of glossing over certain details with the expectation that the reader will already have an idea in their head. And that's sometimes a mistake.
Sorry, did you say it was dangerous?
Well, I said sometimes it's a big mistake.
Yes. Yeah, okay.
Like perhaps it's a miniature, it's a tiny version of this thing that the reader maybe expects to be really large, or like something as simple as scale, if it's not in the text, can create problems in the narrative later, I think is my point.
Yeah, I think so. A lot of this detail stuff is about setting expectations.
Mm-hmm.
One of my common themes in discussions of writing is that the opening parts of your story have to set expectations, and they have to set the value of normal.
Yeah.
Because in order to depart from normal, you have to know what normal is.
For the world, yeah.
For this world, right. And the more similar the world is to our world, the more expectations your reader is going to be bringing to it. And the more stories that the person has read that resemble this story, the more expectations the reader is going to bring along from those other stories. So the problem with Varan is people always think it's medieval. It's totally not medieval. It's totally not medieval. People are like, but how many of you guys heard caste system and thought, oh, medieval? You know, I mean, people do that pretty naturally. They go, oh, medieval. And I'm like, no. So.
Wait, what was that, Shay?
When you say caste system, I think more of India.
You know, some people think of India, and some people go, nobility, medieval, right? So seriously, and this is I've mentioned this before in different sessions, but basically, I have to make sure I mention some form of technology like electricity, you know, maglev vehicles, that kind of stuff. Usually it's electricity because electricity is the easiest thing to refer to. But basically I have to refer to it within the first paragraph, at most within the first half a page. Yeah. So that later when I start going, yeah, maglev vehicles, people go, wait, this is medieval. What are you doing to me?
But they're all wearing robes. How can
I have to do it. No, seriously, I'm not even kidding. I have to do it within the first paragraph to half a page if possible, because unless you set the expectations immediately, the minute that people start to engage their medieval nobility frame, everything that comes outside of that is no longer normal, it's exceptional. So you have to put it right up front so that you say, nobility, yeah, electricity's so hot, this is normal. Right?
See, that's interesting because now there's a link. The conversation, as we're having it now, creates this link between your infrastructure for roads, buildings, energy sources, and fashion, in a sense. And then also, when you think of architecture, it almost can function the same way, I think, as fashion.
Yep. Architectural styles go in and out of fashion, just like everything else.
Well, and you know what? The other thing is that architecture is diverse, right?
Yes.
And the buildings that my nobles hang out in are really, really old, right? So they tend to look like they're in an older place, but they're exceptionally not. You know, the place has been wired for sound. Literally. It's been literally wired for sound. Like every room has microphones that relay what's going on in the room to the servants' quarters so that they know what's going on.
Yeah. Well, and then talking about old architecture versus new architecture in your world building also raises a question culturally in terms of the value we place upon the newness of a thing versus the vintage value of a thing.
Yeah.
And that could be really complicated and interesting. I'm thinking now if you have an antique dealer versus a new manufacturer engaged in like commercial espionage or something.
Well, and you know what? The other thing you don't see, back to fashion for a second, the other thing you don't see very often is people having old-fashioned costume parties in fictional worlds.
That's true.
Right? There's a sort of uniform contemporary quality that sometimes you see in architecture, but not always. And sometimes you see, but very often you see in fashion.
Especially going back to the jumpsuits and lycra.
Yeah.
monochrome uniforms.
Oh. That was like in Star Trek: The Next Generation. Like my mother was always like, how could they have lost the technology of pockets? Why does nobody have a pocket?
Why have they lost pockets? That's awesome.
Yeah, well, and also seatbelts were like a great lost technology as well, because they're always being thrown over, and nobody has a bloody seatbelt. So it's kind of like, it's like, well, where do you put your stuff? Why didn't the Star Trek uniforms have pockets? They're so big.
They had a reason for it, or Roddenberry did have a reason for it that he explained away, but it, it basically came down to, it's the future, nobody needs stuff,
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but there will be no future without my stuff.
That's right. So let's briefly talk about next week, because we are at 12:05 already. We had a last burst of creativity in our discussion.
Once the caffeine kicked in.
And Christophe decided to come and visit. And I hope you can make it earlier next time, Christophe. But anyway, so next week we're going to do naming characters. So we're going to get a little linguistic-y and talk about why we name characters, what we name them, and how onomatopoeia factors in, and all kinds of other topics. And I would hope that if you would like to bring examples from your work, and, for example, tell us about what your reasoning was in choosing a name or creating a name for a particular character, I'd love to hear about it, because let me tell you, I'm going to be telling you about some of my characters. So I want you guys to not feel like I'm just, oh yeah, let's talk about me all the time. I want to talk about you guys and the characters that you're designing and why you might have picked names for them like that. So what I'm going to do is, now that I've sort of mentioned that as happening next week, I'm going to stop the broadcast. Thanks to everybody who watched, and thanks to everybody for coming. And we will resume next week.